welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, which is Stanford's interdisciplinary investment in solving environmental problems that are related to climate, food, water, health, and oceans. You know, increasingly we think about the agenda as being one where climate change provides the umbrella, and when we look at all the other solutions areas, what we're really trying to figure out is how to adapt to a changing climate, how to make people, economies, and ecosystems resilient enough that they can tolerate the changes that can't be avoided. And that sort of sets the stage for today's conversation, which is about where we've been with greenhouse gas emissions recently, why it's been so difficult to bend the curve, where the bright spots are, and what we can be doing in the future. I'm super pleased today to be joined by a panel of experts who can address diverse aspects of this challenge. Let me introduce them briefly, and I'll then say a few words about the format for today's conversation. I want to emphasize that it is really intended as a conversation, and we look forward to questions and thoughts from you as much as to sharing some of our ideas. So at the far end, joined by Rob Jackson, the Douglas Professor at Stanford and the Chairman of the Department of Earth System Science. Rob's an expert in essentially the global carbon cycle. In fact, he chairs an ambitious international effort called the Global Carbon Project, which has really been the most successful investment in mapping, quantifying, explaining the greenhouse gas emissions trajectories, including a really bold new effort on methane. Next is Professor Sally Benson in the Energy Resources Engineering Department at Stanford and the co-director of the Precourt Institute for Energy, which is Stanford's interdisciplinary investment in understanding energy technologies, barriers, and opportunities. And then closest to me is Sheila Benini, who is the lead for corporate engagement at the World Wildlife Fund and is in that role responsible for interactions with more than 100 corporations around the world, encouraging them to adopt sustainability measures that really make a big difference. Sheila's background had her at the Sustainability Consortium, where she was the CEO for several years, and before that at McKinsey & Company, where she had really pushed the idea of corporate sustainability over an extended period of time and has worked now for decades on trying to find ways to advance the broad goals of corporate sustainability. What we'd like to do today is really frame the issue of greenhouse gas emissions trajectories and give all of you a chance to share your ideas, but mostly to set the stage for solutions. And one of the things that we really pride ourselves on at Stanford is not being depressed at the depressing data that we continue to release, but using it as a way to empower movement toward meaningful solutions that address the real needs of the private sector, of governments, of people, and of ecosystems. And in that spirit, I'm going to start out with one question to each of the panelists. We'll have a few minutes of Q&A among the panelists and me, and then we'll open it to questions to all of you. And we'll allow more than half of the time for questions from you, so you should start thinking about the issues that you'd like to raise. When we do go to the questions from the audience, I want to remind you to wait for a microphone. We're recording and videotaping this, and you have your chance for undying fame and glory if you wait for the microphone. And when you start your question, please let us know your name so that the undying fame and glory is associated with you as a person and not as a nameless shape. So let me start with a question to Rob about where we are in the trajectory of global greenhouse gas emissions and how we should understand the patterns that we're seeing in the atmosphere and from the smokestacks.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming. We have a lot of experts in the room, and so we'll try and be brief as we go along. I'll maybe answer that question through the lens of the U.S. first, and then maybe briefly looking at what's happening internationally. And I suppose focus first and foremost on last year. So why was 2018 unusual for emissions? And the short answer to that for the US is that our emissions were up about 3% last year in 2018, which is, has been counter to the trend of the last 5 to 10 years. And there are some sort of idiosyncratic reasons for that, weather-related reasons, heating and cooling. And then there are some more systematic reasons for that. So if we think about the different sectors, the number one trend in emissions for the US that you're all familiar with is the decline in coal. And that's a real success story on many fronts. Emissions from coal have dropped about 40% over the last 10 years and has been made up or replaced by increased natural gas use, and then of course by a really just a transformational increase in renewables such as wind and solar. That is good through the lens of climate, but that's also saving lives. The two biggest sources of air pollution mortality in the country are coal-fired power plants and our cars and vehicles. So that transformation alone not only is helping the climate, but it's saving literally thousands of people a year just from that one thing. So that's reducing our emissions because the emissions with natural gas burning are less than those for coal. But everything else we're doing is going up. So last year in the US, our natural gas use went up over 10%. And some of that is just sort of year-to-year variation, but a lot of that is outside the electricity sector. And that's really the key to what's happening in the US. It's industrial uses, it's heating, and only about a third, a little more than a third of the natural gas we use goes to the electricity sector, and that's where the offsetting for coal is coming in. So natural gas use is way up. And then the most intractable sector of the economy is the transportation sector for emissions. And air traffic is up another few percent, and our petroleum use is slowly but steadily going up year after year. So where that leaves us at the end of 2018 is now off target in terms of the Paris commitment for the US. And as everyone knows, the Paris commitments internationally were only for about 3 degrees. So the Paris Agreement was a start, but not an end to the kind of climate stabilization that we're all seeking. So I think that's the biggest challenge in the US has been the continuing increase in natural gas use outside of the electricity sector, and then the slow but steady rise in petroleum. And then we see a similar picture internationally, and I'll be brief. Coal use peaked in 2013 and may have peaked permanently, and that would be quite a dramatic transformation, whether we've actually seen peak coal or not. But in addition to the US emissions going up, we're up about 6% in India last year, 5% in China. India has 300 million people who don't have access to electricity, and a person in India on average uses 1/10 of what I use. So it's very hard to criticize India for providing baseline reliable power to hundreds of millions of people for the first time in their lives. But there are these international factors. We have to provide 1 billion more people with access to reliable energy at the same time that we cut our emissions. So there's some good things happening internationally. Emissions are going down in Europe, not as fast as they were. They're on average going down a bit in the US, not as fast as they were. And so unfortunately, we're building more fossil fuels, and the renewables that we're building globally generally are not offsetting fossil fuel use. It's just that our total energy use is going up.
One quick follow-up, Rob. Would you say that any of the increase in the US or internationally had a component that was due to some of the regulatory rollbacks in the current administration?
Here in the US or the?
Well, or internationally as a consequence of perceptions about less need to be ambitious with respect to climate emissions?
I don't think that's the case. Not others may have direct knowledge and may have a different opinion, but I don't see it as a reaction, if that's what you mean, to people saying, all right, now we don't have to worry about this so much anymore. But there is this dynamic that we all feel, right? And you especially feel it when you get out of this country. If the U.S. isn't going to, if we're not going to act boldly and in our best interest, it does put a damper on how people both perceive us and our businesses and the goodwill that we have, but also, and just what everyone else will do. So I guess it's a partial answer, a little bit, but I don't see that as a major factor. I don't know how others feel.
Well, we may come back to that at the end.
Okay.
Sally is kind of our evangelist for non-emitting energy, all the way from fossil with carbon capture and storage to electric vehicles and renewables. And we have seen tremendous growth in the deployment of renewables in the last few years, and they're really getting to be a meaningful part of the economy at very competitive prices. And tell us where you think that we're headed in terms of non-emitting energy and whether we could make it transition faster.
Sure. So to pick up a little bit from where Rob left off, so the big story I think is that we had economic growth around the world and in the United States. And really the big challenge is we need to decouple economic growth because that's improving well-being for many people around the world and in the United States. But we can't tolerate those increased emissions. So the question is what are the things we can do today to address that? If we were sitting here 10 years ago, what I would be telling you is that, oh, well, on the horizon, there's solar photovoltaics, there's wind, there's electric cars, but I would say, oh, they're all too expensive. The reality is today, they're not too expensive. Electricity from photovoltaics, particularly utility-scale photovoltaic farms, can be the cheapest source of electricity, cheaper than wind, cheaper than natural gas, cheaper than coal. Contracts around the world are being led at like 2 cents a kilowatt hour. That's extraordinary. Similarly, if you look at wind power, wind turbines are getting bigger and bigger. They're operating with higher capacity factors, again, driving down costs. Wind, 3 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And just to give you a baseline, in the United States, natural gas-fired power generation is about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So the renewables are genuinely cheaper. And the other thing is that the renewables are growing at an extraordinary pace. They're growing, photovoltaics, maybe 50% a year, wind a little bit less than that, but nevertheless growing at a huge pace. But back to this question of, well, why did emissions go up then? Well, renewables are growing from a very small base. That they maybe 10%, 20%, depending upon where you are, a small fraction of the economy. On the other hand, natural gas, coal, there's a gigantic base. So even a relatively, small increase percentage-wise in those resources overwhelm the growth of renewables, and that's why we see this sort of divergence. So certainly for electricity generation, there are really good options. And of course, switching from coal to gas is extremely beneficial. And certainly in California, we've had the experience that we are now up to 30% basically wind and solar. And a good deal of the reason that's possible is that we use natural gas plants and we turn them on and off and on and off every day so we can make sure that we meet the demand for electricity. So there's a real synergy between natural gas and renewables that doesn't exist, for example, for a coal plant where it's much harder to ramp that coal plant up and down. So on the electricity front, we're in good shape. I think that the other place that's super exciting is electric vehicles. You can buy a really beautiful electric vehicle that will drive you, 200, 230 miles today. It's not inexpensive, but it's, in the sort of mid-range cars, very attractive. There are many other low-price electric cars. In places like China, they're really taking off, India, and so forth. By 2025, our studies suggest that electric vehicles will be cost competitive with internal combustion vehicles. That's the good news. The bad news is that Americans in general tend to like bigger cars. They like trucks. They like SUVs. More than 50% of light-duty transport is actually met by these much more fuel-intensive vehicles. So there has to be behavioral change. People need to decide for these other choices. So, but options there. Just to say a little bit more about you mentioned industry, that a lot of the reason that our emissions grew is because we were using more natural gas for industry. That's a hard sector to crack, it's an industry that does need high temperatures, heat, and so forth. So what do we do with that? So there's a technology, carbon capture and storage, where you put on a chemical scrubber on the emission source. You compress that, and you can pump that carbon dioxide deep underground, either into something called a saline aquifer, which is basically rocks that are filled with very salty water, or you could put it back in oil fields. That's a technology that's being done today at a scale of about 31 million tons. That probably doesn't mean much. It's quite a small amount, but nevertheless, through 18 different projects, there's proof of concept that this technology can also play an important role. And I'll just highlight one more project before I stop. So this is a project in Illinois where there's an ethanol plant. ADM operates an ethanol plant. It used to emit 1 million tons a year of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as part of the ethanol production process. They now take that carbon dioxide, compress it, and pump it underground into an aquifer directly underneath that plant. And that's a project that's going very well in the United States. And again, good proof of concept that those kind of approaches can help us reduce our industrial emissions. And I think I'll wrap up with that.
And this is one of the first examples of BECCS, of biomass energy
Right.
with carbon capture and storage.
Right, exactly.
Let me just come back to one point you made about the kind of juxtaposition between the rapid growth of renewables and the growth in everything else, that in some ways the fact that emissions went up last year doesn't take away from the fact that renewables are still growing rapidly, and that trajectory appears set to sustain itself, at least for the near term.
Absolutely. The year-over-year growth of renewables far exceeds the year-over-year growth of anything else. I mean, if you look where is investment in new energy facilities, by and large, renewables are dominating. It's renewables and gas, which is, again, a lot better than the alternative being coal.
And Sheila, we've talked now some about what's happening, but I want to turn to you on the corporate side to think about why it's happening. And I'm particularly interested in your experience with what are the factors that are leading companies to make sustainability commitments, what you're doing to make sure that when they make those commitments, they stick with them, and what you see as the universe for operation. How much can companies do?
Yeah. So I want to also just carry on the conversation, though, about the recent emissions, because we've seen this trajectory, this significant downward trajectory, and it's really only this year, and we are seeing the whole economic recession and the coming back from the economic recession. So it's kind of natural that emissions will go up when you have a recovery. But the overall trajectory is significantly lower than where we were in 2005. So I think there's some optimism. It doesn't mean it's enough. I completely agree it's not enough, but the optimism around the direction we're taking, and it is driven by the reduction in coal and the increase in the renewables. The other thing that I'm optimistic about is not just with the companies, which I'll get into, but the state and local activity, which has really surged since the U.S. pulled out of Paris, and ourselves with some others put together an initiative called We're Still In, which now has 3,600 signatories, and these are what we call non-state, which is confusing, basically not the federal level players, so state, local, and companies. And that has had significant progress, representing something like half of the population if you kind of look at the companies and the states and the cities that are involved. So there's significant interest in the public that has changed around this issue of climate change, which I think relates to the corporates as well. I work with mostly international companies, the big ones that are that we think we can leverage through their influence and their size and scale. And I am optimistic also by what I'm seeing there. We have over 100 US-based companies that have set science-based targets. So these are in line with what the science is, at least the last sort of version of it. And several of them are even renewing to the 1.5 degree pathway, like Procter & Gamble, so the ones whose targets have come up. So and these are significant large companies. These aren't small. And I think what's important about it is they're not just operating in the US. There's supply chains because they're setting targets not just about their operations and what's in their four walls, but about their products and about their supply chain, so what we call Scope 3. And that's often scattered all over globally in many of these places that are hard for us to drive the emissions that we need to see. So I'm optimistic by our specific partners. We're working, for example, with Walmart, which has set its science-based target, and its Scope 3, or its supply chain, commitment is to have a gigaton, which is a billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions avoided in the next 15 years. Or they started already, so it's less than 15 years. And in the first year, they've already reduced 20 million metric tons, which is significant because that was the size of their last goal. It was a 10-year goal with 20 million metric tons. So this is just a very, very big commitment if you think of a billion tons of carbon. But what I think is especially interesting about it is it's not just in energy use, right? It's across areas of agriculture, deforestation, packaging, and product use, and the energy, the kind of ones that you would think. And what's exciting about that is it has a ripple effect beyond just climate to some of the other land-based things that we as a conservation organization care about, because the planet needs not just for us to manage our carbon, but it also needs to make sure that we're retaining biodiversity and forests that we need for all of us to live, really. So I think that's exciting. I think other organizations like McDonald's have also set these really difficult targets that are going to make them work globally on issues like beef emissions, right? That's incredibly difficult. It also takes into account land and thinking about some of the things like the carbon storage in grasslands. It also takes into account deforestation and, again, that carbon storage in our forests. So I think taking this argument broader and really looking at that holistic whole planet view of how are we going to maintain the planet and the climate. And I do think that a lot of the things that we do to maintain the planet also have that beneficial carbon piece of it. And so I think that we're now getting into that phase where we're seeing these companies realize this is good for my business, and it's also good for the long term, right? Am I going to have a business? And that makes me optimistic. I think the truth is, though, we need all this great activity at the state and local level, at the corporate level, but we also need it at the federal level. Yeah. And that's where it's missing. And I think if we can get this ground-up activity to influence the top-down, I think that's where we're really going to see it all come together. But I would have one last thing, which is about the increase in emissions being around transport. The other optimistic thing is you have California and 13 other states, which represent something like a third of all new vehicle sales, really pushing for stricter emissions restrictions on vehicles and the light trucks that you mentioned.
Hopefully we'll be allowed to continue to do that.
And hopefully we'll be allowed to continue to do that, exactly. But I think that there's, again, like I say, that bottom up, and it's not just addressing the renewables, but also addressing that transport sector. I think we still have the other piece on the industrial, but I think there's a bunch of levers on all of these different things, and we need to push them.
Let me ask a quick follow-up on the corporate initiatives, and you can imagine that the corporates are mainly pushed by consumer pressure or mainly pushed by sort of CEO and board level pressure. And what's your perception of the relative role of each of those, and is a company like Walmart really thinking I can increase sales if I'm known as the icon of sustainability?
I think they're a good example because it's probably not top of mind for their consumers. I think as we're seeing millennials, they care more. I don't think they care, they know specifically and can say, oh, I can talk about greenhouse gas, but what they want is they want to trust. So they want to trust that their retailer or their brands that they're buying are doing the right thing. And I think that's important because that's built into why so many of these companies are pursuing these things. Their consumers may not understand the details of what they're doing, but it will make them feel comfortable and trust overall that I'm shopping at a good place or I'm buying from a good company. Those things are important. I do think, though, it's important to realize that these companies work on a global stage. So it was interesting to us how many of them jumped up right away to sign on to our We're Still In initiative. We call it WASI. But part of that is they don't want to be identified as laggards just because they're US companies. They want to identify in all those other markets where they're working, they need to be seen as a global player just like their peers who are in Europe or in other places. So I think there's a piece of it that's important to take into account. It's not just consumers who are their stakeholders. It's a broader world out there. One other thing about Walmart, though, Walmart's been talking about, they used to always talk about their low everyday prices, but they talk about this low, I forget what it is, now I should remember the exact words, but the idea is that it's the all-in price. I think they believe that this bundle of things they're doing on the environment will reduce their overall costs. And they'll then be able to give, that's it, the true cost, everyday low, true cost. And a number of these initiatives, I mean, they've been able to do renewables in the money and save money. They've been able to do all these things on product efficiency, save money. In their stores, you reduce refrigeration, you reduce lighting costs, you save money, you save greenhouse gas emissions. There are some of these things that may have a negative cost, but on balance, particularly as you're looking at the greenhouse gas emissions, you spend money on energy and fuel.
Yeah.
So it makes huge economic sense to use less.
Yeah, I do want to come back to this topic of why there are so many opportunities that are left on the table, but I want to pick up the topic of trust a little bit and go back to Rob with a question about monitoring and verification. And what's your sense of where we are in being able to provide accurate, trustworthy information about emissions at different scales, all the way from the national scale to the company scale?
Yeah, and I think it's an exciting time because we have pretty good data. I mean, the uncertainties in the natural carbon cycle, oceans and land use change, for example, deforestation are bigger than the uncertainties around the industrial sector. So we have work to do in these other sectors as well. But there's just a lot going on. There is a lot more public information on emissions. Companies, states, other countries. We are developing new tools for emissions. We're not there yet, but we're moving pretty quickly towards a world where you might, say, be able to verify emissions at a large city scale. Inversion models where we can look at sort of as an air mass moves across the U.S. or across Russia, or China or other countries. We really have, through towers and other things, not perfect information by any sense, but we kind of know when something doesn't match up at a macro scale. So I think the satellites, new aircraft technologies, there's a lot more ground-based observations that are available. So I'm optimistic about the emissions verification. It's tougher in the methane and nitrous oxide space. A lot lower concentrations in the atmosphere, larger diffuse emissions, agricultural sites, individual farms, fewer power plants, the kind of the really large point sources that are easier, frankly, to track and watch. So our job is more difficult in the methane and nitrous oxide space. Good things happening in the methane space too, with some satellite technologies and other things. But a lot more to do with verifications and such. But I'm optimistic about that.
Do you feel like the whole verification environment needs to move forward as one thing, or can we take advantage of the technologies that are ready to go now?
Oh, my view of it is exactly like my view of the climate solution space. We basically need everything, everything that we can, and we want different tools and technologies for different scales. There are some things that you can do by vehicle measurements and ground monitoring stations and things like that, and other things that we can only do by aircraft and satellites and really tall towers that give us a picture high up into the atmosphere that averages over really large areas that air mass covers. So I think we need all of those scales and technologies to help us. But I think that maybe the most exciting thing is is greater transparency. I think in the methane space, we're not so many years away, maybe 5, where you or I as a citizen might be able to go online and see a large emission source in the United States or in Russia or Nigeria, for that matter. That kind of information, some of it's public, some of it's private, but some of it's public. And I think that kind of information is going to help companies find large sources more quickly, make it easier for people to see who's doing the best job, give companies credit, who are cutting emissions, and frankly point out the places and the industries and such that aren't doing as good a job. So that kind of transparency in public information is very powerful.
Well, I agree it's powerful for public pressure on corporates. I I sometimes wonder whether countries might view that as a motivation to be more cautious about their commitments.
Interesting, yeah.
Sally, I do want to get back to this point that Sheila raised about the opportunity to save money at the same time you're converting to non-emitting sources. And you already mentioned the very low prices on solar and wind. Is it your sense that those technologies are really ripe and available, and that the factors that are limiting the pace of engagement are related to something other than the technological maturity and the availability of good products?
Yeah, I would put that into two buckets. So even though renewable electricity can be cheaper, excuse me, than the alternative, you have to decide that you actually want to invest in a substitute for your current system. And by and large in the United States, we have more than enough generation to accommodate, demand and so forth. So lacking policies that encourage or require, people to make those investments, we're not going to see them. Now, it's entirely different if you're in India or Africa where you're building out your energy system for the first time. You have to make those investments. You want to make those investments. So that's a different issue, which brings up the second issue, and that is that systems. So clearly the components have gotten cheap enough so that in the moment they can provide you the lowest cost electricity. But the reality is, let's look first at the electricity system. We need electricity 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And photovoltaics, as an example, they're cheap in the middle of the day, but you need nighttime power. If you have a month-long, like in the parts of the Midwest, bad weather for a month, your photovoltaics are not going to help you. So you really need to think about the full system. And I think for those motivated to address these issues or required, that's the frontier that we really need to work on, is how do you integrate solar and wind and hydro and battery storage and natural gas plus CCS? How do you integrate that system to make it work? That's markets, that's planning, that's coordinated investment. That's a way more challenging thing to do than simply say, oh, I'm going to put a PV panel on my house. Similarly, in the electric vehicles, again, very, very exciting, soon to be the lowest cost way to get around and least polluting, including all the air quality impacts that you talked about. But at some point, if we all want to charge our vehicles, if we all go home and we plug in our vehicles at 6:30 at night and all try to charge, well, that's going to overwhelm, the electricity system. So if we're going to move towards massive vehicle electrification, we're going to need to address workplace charging. We need a network of supercharger stations. We need information and controls within the electricity distribution system so we can do this. So again, that's the frontier there. It's the systems, infrastructure investments, and I think that's where policies need to be really focused to incentivize those system solutions.
And Sheila, would you say that the companies have a different set of capabilities in terms of doing this kind of system level thinking about their own emissions and the ones that they control? And I was particularly interested in the comments you made about investments in efficiency, which are in a little different category than these investments in power generation.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I always see for the companies, there's two things they can do to reduce their emissions. They can reduce their demand, right? Or they can change the supply. And I do think that they can play a role in this change as well by creating the demand for the renewables. So we have another initiative, our Renewable Energies Buyer Alliance, REBA, which...
you guys are good for acronyms here.
Yeah, I know, and we are WWF, World Wildlife Fund. We have a lot of them. But that one has been particularly successful in trying to get renewables on the grid, where a number of companies have set these goals around their emissions, or a lot of them have goals to be 100% renewable, to have their energy supplied by 100% renewable energy, and yet they're in a place where they don't have renewables on the grid. So what do? And this is where this alliance brings people together in the same region so that they can then go to their energy provider and say, hey, I'm a big user of energy, and this guy over here, this other company, which is local, also a big user of energy, and we'd like you to put more renewables on the grid so that we can be able to meet our goals. So they can play a role. Also, a number of employers are starting to do things like put in the charging stations and preferential parking spaces for the cars. So I do think that there's things that companies can do on that side, which is the supply side. In terms of the reduction in demand, I think there's a ton of money on the table that companies are not getting at. And I think part of the reason is because it's often cost savings, which is never as sexy as growth. Everybody wants growth. And it's also, it's very reliable, and so it's kind of like a lower volatility or in what you're going to get. But the growth stuff often offers much bigger returns, right? Less predictable, but bigger returns. So I think that's one of the dynamics that would be interesting to figure out. How do you break that dynamic internally? Often the way they do that is if you have a really, really ambitious goal, then people are like, well, we have to do this because we have this climate goal, and that helps break through that. But they do often have the ability to kind of look at things with a longer time horizon than we often take, and often than politicians take, despite the fact that everybody talks about the quarterly earnings and all of that. I mean, companies make plants that last 30 years, right? They are very capable of making longer term decisions and looking out longer. It's very hard in our political system for politicians to do that. So that, I think, is a big advantage that they have. They also have tremendous capital, right? I mean, they have a lot more, ability to make a big investment and try to drive some change. So yes, I think though they need to come together and get there.
Great.
So Chris, could I just add one specific
Please,
example, relevant for Stanford? So Stanford is basically a small city. We use about 30 megawatts of power, so it's like a small city. And because it's a single agent responsible for all investments regarding all the infrastructure, it was able to switch out its heating and cooling system, achieved a 60% efficiency savings in doing that, commensurate greenhouse gas savings, and then decided to build actually 2 big photovoltaic arrays to get to 100% renewable. So institutions, anyone who has a campus or a factory, they can make tremendous progress because it's all under their control, unlike residential areas.
And as much as that's a really laudable step, it was primarily undertaken to save money.
Right. Well, that's the good news too, right?
That's one reason. That's,
Yeah.
I mean, from my perspective, a lot of the companies that have done these kinds of things they either started it out with a little goal, and they started down the path, and they're like, geez, this saves money. And so then they kind of up the game. And now I think for so many of them, it's just obvious that this makes huge economic sense.
And so much of this is about being able to think long term.
Yep.
And long-term often isn't all that long. And I think that Stanford had something like a 7-year payback on their investment in the new energy system.
Right, yeah. It was the sort of cheapest possible alternative that they could have done.
I want to turn over to questions from the audience after one more. So start thinking of what your question is. And one set of technologies we haven't talked yet about, but people are beginning to think about a lot more and talk about a lot more, is tackling this problem not only from the rate at which we emit gases to the atmosphere, but also removing them. Sally's thought a lot about CO2 removal, and Rob's beginning to think a lot about methane removal. And I wonder if you want to put those elements into this discussion.
You want to go first? Or?
No, folks.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. I mean, if you look at integrated assessment models that take you on a trajectory to 1.5 degrees C warming or even 2 degrees C warming, because we've been so slow to respond to this, we are now, the inevitability of needing to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, beginning somewhere between, say, 2050 and 2100, the so-called negative emissions technologies. And there are a huge number of things you can do, and the National Academy just released a big report in November called Negative Emissions and Reliable Sequestration. So that involves things like forestry, changing agricultural practices, putting forests where they didn't used to be, coastal management to encourage accumulation of organic matter in wetlands. So those are the natural kinds of solutions, but there are also solutions involving more engineering approaches. And one of them is a technology called direct air capture, where literally you put a chemical scrubber on the atmosphere. Just like you could put a chemical scrubber on the smokestack of a power plant, you can also scrub carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this is a technology that, again, 10 years ago, nobody was even really talking about this. Today, there are 3 companies offering commercial products. They're quite expensive, but nevertheless, they're moving down that trajectory. So the idea would be you'd scrub carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and if you wanted to sequester it, you could, again, put it deep underground. Perhaps you could even put it in volcanic rocks, and it would react with those rocks to make solid minerals. So that's one approach. Another approach is something called bioenergy plus carbon capture and storage, where you would use biomass, so woody materials, ag residues, to produce power, electricity, a biomass power plant, and then you would capture the carbon dioxide and sequester it. And again, since the trees are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and you're then sequestering it, you can achieve negative emissions. So there are lots of moving parts in all of this. I think really the key issue is scale. We need these solutions at the billion-ton and greater scale. And when we look out at this landscape, every one of these options would involve significant challenges. So these are early days, but very, very important to continue to make progress in the technology and understanding the potential of these options.
Yeah, just to put things in context, we talk about getting to the billion-ton scale. That global CO2 emissions last year, based on Rob's study, were about 37.1 billion tons of CO2. And if you include the CO2 equivalent forcing of all the other greenhouse gases, it's up around 50 billion tons per year, where in order to stabilize climate, we really need to be at 0.
Yeah, building on what Sally said, I think there are maybe 2 lenses. One is capturing emissions now, and then the other is this longer-term goal of actually going negative, where you're drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. I mean, you look at California, or you look at let's take not California, let's take Denmark. I mean, why is Denmark able to go now approaching 50% wind, and they have good wind resources? But another reason is they have nuclear as a backstop, right? So there are other technologies that all of us will need in addition to wind and solar to provide reliable, dispatchable power. And if we're going to go away from nuclear, as we're doing in California, closing the Diablo plant, for instance, what is that something else going to be? And possibility, not a bad mix in our part of the world, might be renewables with a long-term natural gas carbon capture and storage component to it. Again, as Sally or Chris or someone was saying, you can dial up and down relatively easy. Doesn't have to be natural gas and CCS, but something like that could be an option if we're going to go away from reliable power sources like nuclear. It doesn't make a great deal of sense to me to talk about spending a lot of money taking CO2 out of the air at 400 parts per million when we have billions of tons of gases going into the air at 100,000 parts per million at 10%. So I would put my thermodynamic effort and my economic effort on those smokestacks first, before we spend a lot of money saying, yeah, we're going to run the coal cycle in reverse, which is literally the scale it would take to make a big dent using direct air capture. It would be a massive scale. So I would start with the smokestack emissions and look at moving those below ground and doing other things to reduce them. And then on Chris mentioned the methane space. I said earlier, methane and nitrous oxide are harder because they're more diffuse and they're lower concentration in the atmosphere. But there's a lot of bang for the buck that we can get from those gases, methane in particular. Methane is responsible for about 1/6 of the total warming forcing that we have right now. So if we could dial back the methane emissions quickly, it buys us more time to deal with the longer-lived greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. So there aren't similar efforts yet on methane capture, and it's thermodynamically more difficult. But all of these things should be in play long term. But short term, we need to be focusing on the large sources of emissions to the atmosphere first and foremost. And there can be those that are captured and stored underground. And then finally, I think it is, we're technology people, and I would argue many of you probably are technology people too. But there are social factors that are involved. And you look at the Germany example when they, in Cologne and other areas, when they went to implement new coal infrastructure with carbon capture and storage out in the North Sea, those projects were basically scuttled by public resistance. And it wasn't mostly about safety because the CO2 sequestration was away from where the people are. There was a perception that that effort enabled coal to continue as a power source. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but there's we cannot ignore the fact that people around the world will not allow us to stick whatever we want wherever we want it. We will have to have social buy-in for the technologies that we use, and that holds for carbon capture and storage. I think there are some states in this country where you could sell that. In a Texas kind of environment, you've got a lot of pore space that's free from the oil and gas industry. It's going to be a tougher sell in California, and in some other states. So we cannot ignore the role that people play in siting infrastructure. It's no different than a pipeline.
You can use it to fill up all of the ground that's sinking from the groundwater extraction.
Right. We pay the oil companies to put the CO2 back in that they took out. So.
Okay.
I entirely agree that going after the concentrated sources makes sense. Yeah, that's the way to start.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn it over to questions from all of you. Remember to please wait for the microphone, tell us your name, and make your questions as brief as and consistent with their content.
Hi, my name is Julia Genti. I have a question in general for anyone. It's more of an opinion-based question. I believe it was Sheila who mentioned how effective international pressure is in driving businesses to implement more environmentally conscious projects and just be more environmentally conscious in general. And I wanted to know if anyone has an opinion as to whether the same applies from an international perspective on policy. Yeah, so anyone who wants to take that question.
Sheila? Chris, you take
well,
that one.
I wish the answer were yes. I think obviously we're seeing good activity at the state and local level, not at the federal level. So it would be nice, but I think the trends in policy at the federal level are not moving in the direction that we'd like it to see.
I think that the policy responses tend to be a little slower than decision making within corporations and smaller entities. I also, asked Rob earlier if he thought that some of the rollbacks in the U.S. had made a difference, and I agree that it's too early to say for sure, but I think that the leadership opportunity that's reflected in a commitment to move forward has really been dissipated by the position of the U.S. government on the issue, and that restoration of that, not primarily as a moral position, but simply as a statement that it's a right thing to do, economically, fiscally, environmentally, I think will be incredibly helpful.
Yeah. I'll add a little to that. I think that for American manufacturers to be competitive, the automotive industry being an example, that there are demands for very high efficiency vehicles in very large markets like China and India and so forth. So to the extent that the U.S. auto manufacturers want to have products that are competitive, they need to make those very high efficiency products. So actually a rollback of U.S. policy actually makes our industry less competitive in those markets. So I think there's a lot of pressure from that perspective.
I would agree. I think one of our partners forced the trucking that they had to move their products around. They said, we want it renewable. And they're like, oh, we can't do that. And they're like, we want electric trucks. They have them in Europe. You can do it here. And they got them to get the electric trucks because they're saying it happens in Europe and that's what we want. Do it. So I think she's exactly right. So what Sally says is that we are going to be less competitive if we can't move forward.
Natalie, you can pick the next questioner.
Hi, my name is Maxine. I'm a reporter for E&E News. And my question, we've heard a little bit about transportation sector emissions, but I was hoping you could talk more about the difficulty of curbing emissions from the sector, given that, as some of you said, it comes down to behavioral individual choices about what types of vehicle you want to own.
You want to start?
Yeah, I'll just start briefly. I think, first of all, there's a lot of good things happening. The commitments for 5 million electric vehicles in California in the next decade and a half. We got over 1 million electric vehicles in the United States, but hundreds of millions of vehicles. So I think the real question is, how do we get to a position to be like Norway is, where a third of new vehicles being purchased right now are electric, and obviously that's based in part on incentives and such. But there are economies that are embracing electric transportation in ways that are much more integrated, better thought out, and faster than we are in this country. So it's coming in this country, but we're a long way away from that kind of transformation. So I'd like to follow the examples, and I'm not suggesting that the pathway that Norway has used to get there would be the same as our pathway. I don't think it would be, but we can look to these other countries as examples. And then we have to address air traffic. I mean, the reason petroleum use is going up in the United States is more about air travel and other things than it is about our vehicles. Our car and light truck oil use is about flat, but the air sector is going up every year, 2, 3, 4%, and that's even harder to crack than the cars and trucks. So we need efforts in all of these.
Yeah, I think that I don't know how we change people's choice about what car they buy, but if we had aggressive efficiency standards on every type of vehicle that people were buying, including SUVs and trucks and so forth, that were very ambitious, that would certainly help reduce emissions from the transportation sector.
I would echo that, and I also think right now the way the emission standards are, there's kind of a out for the SUVs and the pickup trucks. So it's a little bit easier for the car makers to make those economically, and they can make a lot more money on them, which I think one of the levers of changing behavior is also what they choose to spend their marketing dollars on. And they very much choose to spend their marketing dollars. I don't know how many of you watch TV and you see the advertisements. There's a lot of advertisements for SUVs and such, and standard cars as opposed to the electric. And if you were bombarded constantly with electric, and electric's the coolest thing, and
The cool kids all drive electrics. That's the
exactly, then maybe, I mean, I don't know, I'm not an expert in marketing, but just the marketing spend difference does make a difference in terms of what we're all exposed to. And I look out at some of these companies, and they're amazing at what they can get us to purchase, right? So you take that muscle and you say, let's put that muscle into making us purchase things that are better for the environment. I think that would be a really, really good thing. So I do think there are some known behavioral change things that you can use. It's just a decision of where to put that marketing money.
great. Next, and tell us where you're from in addition to your name.
Hello.
That's good.
Hi. I'm Brian Lampert. I'm from Connecticut. So, yeah.
Representing Connecticut.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm from NRDC, but the Connecticut part's relevant to my
Okay.
question, so I brought it up. We just kind of talked about a little bit about how it can be difficult to get the consumer to think about electric vehicles. Now, as I understand it, I guess my question is, well, how about utility companies? So as I understand it, utility companies pretty much have a guaranteed rate on return, and the more people that use their electricity, the more money they make. Now in Connecticut, people don't drive electric vehicles because the problem is we don't have charging infrastructure, but Eversource is hesitant to make their own charging infrastructure because people don't drive electric vehicles. And they've done this in Massachusetts, where they've invested in charging infrastructure, and now lots of people are driving EVs. Eversource is making a lot of money, and we're getting downward pressure on rates. So if it's a little difficult to get consumers, because stuck in their ways, they don't want to drive EVs, what is a good strategy on getting utilities involved in actually investing in charging infrastructure? Because on the theory then that once the charging infrastructure is actually there, range anxiety and other things are going to go down. We're more willing to purchase it. So what's a good way to get the utilities involved?
Somebody want to start with that? I just reiterate your point that if you wanted to set up a company and you said, okay, I can go into a business where I can get a guaranteed rate of return, no matter how I screw up, I'm still going to be in business with this rate of return, that'd be a pretty compelling option. And
Unless your name's PG&E.
We'll get back to them later. But, it really is a constitutionally flawed business model that's creating part of the challenge. And I think that until we can change aspects of the business model and have the popular or governmental influence shape some of the directions of the utilities, it is going to be hard to really serve the public interest. I don't know.
I've been thinking about this lately. I mean, if you look at wind, it benefited from a production tax credit, federal tax credit. If you look at solar, there was an investment tax credit that really helped get those industry going. And there were also portfolio standards in some states. So a variety of incentives have been used to stimulate investment, and then the consequences that you have deployment at scale and the costs get driven way down. I think of those as transitional incentives. They're things you want to do as long as it's needed before it's economical. So I think for charging infrastructure, workplace charging infrastructure, charging stations that people can drive up to, I think it would be really interesting to look at some of these incentives that worked in other places, and why not see if they couldn't work in the case of charging infrastructure.
We got the microphone over here.
Yes, Jack Warner with Climate Institute. Just was wondering if you've also started to take a look at the potential role of hydrogen as a fuel. California's taking some good strides right now in getting that into the transportation sector. So I just kind of want to get your thoughts on hydrogen.
You guys have
Yeah.
some hydrogen projects, right?
That's for you guys.
Right, yeah. So hydrogen is really interesting. So we've thought about this particularly for two applications. One is for light-duty vehicles. And it turns out that battery electric vehicles appear to have won that competition. The prices have come down faster. We don't think that, even if there are radical improvements, for example, in fuel cell vehicles, and you have really cheap hydrogen, it's just probably too late. Similarly for household energy storage, as an alternative to a battery. So some of the bigger markets, more mass markets, are challenging for hydrogen, but there are some markets where it seems to make a lot of sense. Heavy-duty trucking is one that is really interesting. Thinking about in port areas is very interesting, because ports, there's a very large pollution burden from all of the diesel and all that's used, and so hydrogen would have sort of win-win. It would be basically low polluting power supply and source of fuel. So that kind of application. Industry, hydrogen makes a lot of sense. So there are applications where this can play. Hydrogen is complicated because, well, number one, our biggest source of hydrogen today is natural gas. If we were to just produce hydrogen the way we do and emit carbon into the atmosphere in the process of doing that, there really wouldn't be a big benefit. If you look at competitors like electrolysis, that's about triple the cost of natural gas-based hydrogen production. So if we want to do hydrogen production, we probably need to think about capturing and storing the carbon that is emitted during that process. There are also complicated supply chain issues on how do you store the hydrogen, between the time you produce it and when it's used. How do you distribute it to all your customers? So I think we are going to see hydrogen come along, but I think it will be in sort of high-value markets where you can create a strong partnership between the supplier and the customer and deal with all those sort of value chain issues in an integrated way so that the financial risk is not so great.
Yeah, let me just add on briefly, because maybe one way that I can see hydrogen from a more bullish sort of economy-wide perspective, and that is addressing this issue of intermittency and storage with renewables. And I can see a model. I don't, I'm not talking about whether it's economically viable and the many things that would have to be worked out, but I could see a place for hydrogen if, for instance, we were to couple solar and wind, solar in particular, when the resource is abundant, develop technology at a reasonable cost to generate something like hydrogen, could be ammonia, could be methane even, generate hydrogen which you can store underground. You could potentially store it in some of the same places we store natural gas today. And so that's one pathway where we could produce energy using renewables that would allow us to get past the periods of intermittency that we worry most about. 6 hours, a few hours we can handle with batteries, but you can't handle days to a week with batteries, and probably not with batteries and pump storage either. So there might be a role, in my opinion, for hydrogen coupled to renewables in that sense to generate it, and then it would be more dispatchable for when we really need it. A lot of things to work out for that.
One more quick thing about that is that an attractive feature of hydrogen as an intermittency defense is that you use the same hardware to make the hydrogen as to convert it back to electricity in a fuel cell environment. And a lot of the thing that drives the cost of storage up, or of the intermittency up, is that you end up with some assets that you only use 10% of the time or 1% of the time. And if you have these dual use instruments that are deployed both for the generation and the utilization, you avoid a lot of this high expenditure for low utilization assets.
Yeah. There's one more application that Europe is very interested in, is that often today, if you have solar or wind, a lot of solar or wind, that there are periods where you produce excess electricity and that there's no customer for it. So one idea is to use that excess electricity to make hydrogen and then take that hydrogen and put it in the natural gas grid. So it's basically a way of gradually cleaning up the natural gas grid and providing a customer for that excess solar and wind so that they can generate revenue all the time.
And not to be too Stanford specific, UC Irvine is doing that. Okay, so you can see we're enthusiastic about hydrogen. A couple of questions over here.
Hi, I'm Elliot Roseman with the United States Energy Association. I'd like to ask for your comments on the question of urgency. The reports that have all come out recently can paint a dire picture, do paint a dire picture in a number of cases. And all of the ideas that you have, I think, are excellent ones and will play out and produce benefits over periods of time. But every 1/10 of a degree, every 1/4 of a degree makes a difference, in terms of countries that may be flooded, cities that may be flooded, coral reefs that may be destroyed, et cetera. So not trying to be depressing about it, but what do you think about initiatives at the federal level, for example, this Green New Deal, for example, which is aspirational and needs to have a lot of meat put on the bone. So the question of urgency, and in that context, I'd also like to hear if you have any thoughts about, and I'm not trying to make folks here feel guilty in any way, but if we ate less meat, there would be a lot less greenhouse gas emissions and a lot less fuel used, a lot less waste, a whole lot of benefits that come from being sort of more, eating meat less frequently, to say nothing of how animals are treated. But, so if you could comment about the urgency issue and about animal agriculture.
I can certainly speak to animal agriculture.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let me start out with a way to think about this issue of what the target should be. Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change says the objective of this convention is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. I think there's overwhelming evidence that we failed to do that. We've already seen dangerous anthropogenic interference. And so now a more realistic question is, well, what's the right balance between damages that we incur, investments that we make in mitigation, and commitments that we make to adaptation? Because there really are things we can do in order to cope more effectively with the climate changes that can't be avoided. And in that context, I think you can really divide the century into two possible scenarios. There's the world of continued high emissions, which we appear to be in, where we end the century at something like 4C over pre-industrial, increasing at 0.5 degree per decade. That's a clearly unmanageable situation. At the other end, we can talk about a world of ambitious mitigation. And I don't think we yet have the ability to predict with precision where we might stabilize. I mean, personally, I consider 1.5 to be incredibly ambitious. But you know, the Paris Agreement says well under 2, and I think that shooting for well under 2 and getting lucky on a few things is still within the realm of feasibility, and certainly even ending up a little higher than 2 is much, much better than the world of continued high emissions. So I think that rather than worrying overwhelmingly about whether some threshold of a super ambitious goal has been passed, the thing we really need to do is mobilize as many resources as possible to stay in this world of ambitious mitigation, recognizing that every tenth we add is going to require not only increased investments in adaptation, but there are going to be some irretrievable things that we lose.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, you know, we need to be much more ambitious than we are. And there's a lot we can do that's at low cost or no cost, particularly these efficiency improvements. And many of these have huge co-benefits for health and so forth. I think, though, we have to recognize that we need the whole world to do this. You know, it's not just the United States. It's also not just electricity, which often we get so fixated on that. So I'm, you know, think we need to be very ambitious. We need to engage the whole world. But you know, we need to do it in a way that, you know, I think we should look to those practices that have been very successful in terms of getting these emissions reductions. You know, look at what are those policies, which countries, and I think we should learn from those kind of experiences. And there are many of them which are very encouraging. At some point, we probably need an economy-wide signal that says a carbon tax that starts out high enough and increases at a very steady pace to get it so that all actors are starting to contribute to the solution.
Well, we got a pile on here. This one's too, well, I thought maybe, you know, adding on to Sally's, I mean, it is absolutely true that, as we've talked before today about these other countries, and you know, I mentioned India's going to build some additional coal plants, right? They are, and they're going to, and frankly, they should. They have people, you know, there's nothing they can do for their well-being that's more important than relieving energy poverty. And what we want is to have as few of those, as little of that new infrastructure being fossil fuel infrastructure that will be there 40 years from now. I mean, that's really that's the core issue for what's happening there. But I don't have a lot of patience for this notion of, you know, we got to see what, you know, all these other countries, what they have to do. I mean, most of the CO2 up there is ours in Europe. It's not just about what we emit now, it's what we've emitted for the last century. And most of the stuff up there in the bucket of the atmosphere is ours. And as I already said, we use a tenth of, someone in India uses a tenth of what we use in the US. Someone in China uses half or a third of what we use. You know, I'm just tired of us saying we're, you know, let's wait and make sure all these other countries are doing all this. We need to operate here first. It's what we control. We're responsible for most of it. And I know it's politically difficult, but you know, that's my own opinion. And one way to do that, I think, is to change the language a bit that we use when we discuss climate. I mean, we talk about emissions and climate in 2 degrees C because it's an existential threat, and I believe that. But when I talk to my brother, I have a liberal brother, a conservative brother, and I'm a middle child trying to keep everybody happy at Thanksgiving. You know, the transition from coal, we already talked about, is saving lives, and we're creating 100,000 jobs a year in wind and solar in this country, and there aren't 200,000 people in total who work in the coal industry. So the net benefit for employment has been tremendous. You know, the fuel efficiency standards aren't just reducing emissions, they're reducing the 3 million barrels of oil a day that we import from OPEC. They're increasing our national security. There are all these other things that go along with with a reduction in fossil fuel pollution, and that part of the Green New Deal, as nebulous as it is, I think is right. So I guess I get impatient, I guess, in this notion that we just we got to make sure that India and China are going to do their part. We've been doing our part for 100 years, putting this stuff up there, and it's our responsibility to act first.
But I don't think it means waiting. To say that we realize that we have to help the whole world decarbonize doesn't mean we wait. It means we help them more. I mean, if you look at the California experience, we're now at 30% renewables. We'll be at 60% renewables by 2030. We've done that by having a combination of renewables plus a natural gas sort of backbone that makes it all work out. We're going to add a lot of storage. Why not be sharing that experience? And I spend a lot of time in that part of the world, and the narrative they have is, we don't know how to do more than 5 or 10% renewables. It's impossible. Well, it's not impossible, and we can help.
Yeah.
And California's seeing GDP growth at the same time,
Right.
so it's not slowing us down. I would just add, because you asked about the agriculture side, but I do think, I completely agree with Chris, and we're looking at this, we need to do a combination of mitigation and adaptation. We're already seeing climate change, right? We're seeing those catastrophic impacts, and that's actually part of driving the heating and cooling that we've seen in the last year, is because we're getting colder winters and hotter summers. We're seeing that variability from climate change. Without me being technical and scientific about it, it's pretty obvious. But in terms of the agricultural, I think it is a major component in greenhouse gas emissions. And you're right to point out animal protein, but I think it's important to think about the picture globally, because there are places on the planet where people are not getting enough protein, and we are certainly going to see an increase in consumption of animal protein. And we can't ask them not to, in the same way that we've been consuming at our rate, and suddenly say, now you have to be vegetarian your entire life. So I think you have to kind of look at it globally. But I would say, before you even begin changing the diet, there's an easy thing, which is something like 1/3 of all food, if you look across the whole value chain, is wasted. Right? So you're talking about a major contribution in greenhouse gases, agricultural production of food, and we take 1/3 of that. All that greenhouse gas involved in growing the plants or feeding it, and we just dump it in the garbage. So I think that's an easy win for everyone, because it saves money, it saves greenhouse gas, it saves land and water and all these other environmental assets that we pour into our food production. So that's, I think, one piece of it. The other piece of it is there's a huge distribution of production across the worst produced to the best produced in everything, right? And so one of the things that we're doing with proteins in particular is looking at all these proteins and trying to say, if we move all animal protein production to the most efficient, right, we could again take a big cut from greenhouse gas emissions and all these other land-based impacts that we have. So those are some of the things that are kind of no-brainer we should do, which is, let's take what we're consuming today and immediately reduce the impact that it has. And it probably does make sense in many economies, like in Europe and the US. A lot of people are beginning to look at this and beginning to look at the health aspects of the diet as well as the environmental impacts. So I think to me, it's not let's all go become vegetarians, but let's look at this whole picture, do the things that are easiest to change and make the most sense right away as we look at a longer term shift of things that are difficult, like people's diets.
And I think this theme of co-benefits kind of goes through everything we've talked about today, and is a really important part of the narrative. We're going to have time for 2 more questions if we answer really fast. And this side of the room got ignored. Thanks, Word.
Hi,
That's good.
Colin Cunliffe from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Former Secretary Ernie Moniz came out with a report a couple days ago that noted that most of DOE's research and development portfolio is oriented around the power sector and electricity generation. And I don't think it's any coincidence that we've also seen more carbon dioxide emissions reductions in that sector. I'm curious, if you were to design an R&D portfolio around the industrial sector emissions, what do you think that would look like?
Great question. Sally, do you want to start?
Well, the need for heat is, we need to find decarbonized ways of making heat. Hydrogen is one that's quite interesting. We also need to think about chemical synthesis. And in the process of synthesis, there are often emissions of greenhouse gases. So from that perspective, we fundamentally need to think of new ways of making products that can make those same things that we want, but without the greenhouse gas emissions. So historically, there's been a lot of emphasis on industrial efficiency. Companies in general are very motivated by that, but that is not nearly enough. We have to directly go after the emissions. So things like hydrogen, carbon capture and storage are, I think, where we need to go on those, and new synthesis or material substitution.
And one of the things that seems to me is that it's clear that some parts of this problem are much harder than others, but the fact that there are some hard problems doesn't mean we shouldn't be working on the easy ones really hard and on the hard ones recognizing that it's going to take some time.
Right. Well, the other good news about the industrial sources is that, there are only so many companies and so many factories. It's not like we have, millions of households, which is a different type of hard. So that there are a limited number of actors actually can make it easier, that there could be sectoral agreements that, everybody who makes X, cement, will all agree to decarbonize their production, and therefore they don't create imbalances in cost, which, that kind of thing sets up a bad dynamic, which inhibits action. So sectoral approaches in the industry are really important.
Maybe just very briefly, credit to the industry already, because the number one source of saved emissions in this country over the last few decades isn't wind and solar, it's energy efficiency. And that's the one thing we have done the most of to reduce our emissions, and industry has played a role in that. So we have to acknowledge that progress too.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Yeah. I'm Karina Hertzberg, Climate and Environment Counselor at the Embassy of Norway. I have two questions, but first I will say a little bit to our friend from Connecticut about charging infrastructure and rollout of charging in Norway, because Norway's kind of leading in the share of electric vehicles. 5% of all our cars are now electric, and it's just going up. And there has been some public support to roll out charging stations along the main highways and roads. That's been publicly supported. It's not been done by utilities, but by specific charging companies. And we now see that this is starting to move on its own in some of the towns where there's a high concentration of EVs, that on purely commercial basis, fast chargers are being put in place and so on. And one of the fuel retailers in Norway, Circle K, the Canadian chain, they're now planning to scale up tenfold their investments in chargers at their fuel stations. So they will be like transport energy stations. So there's a market there for charging companies and fuel retailers. They're looking in the long run. My questions are really around electricity and other sectors, and to move towards zero carbon, net zero, what that means in terms of electrification of other sectors, not just transportation, but manufacturing, housing, heating. And the question is really what it would take for the US to move in that direction in terms of the investments that would need to be done, how easy or difficult that is. And the second question is actually around the energy system and that mix of renewable energy sources, the possibilities of storage, and how you see hydropower moving into that. Because hydropower is a renewable energy technology that stores energy. It's the main electricity provider in Norway. So interested to hear that. Thanks.
Do you want to go first? Huh?
Well, maybe just taking the end one first, and I know we're running out of time. Obviously there's a lot of hydro being built around the world, and not a lot of large hydro being built in the U.S. That I think it's pretty hard to envision very many large new dams being built, here in this country. So I think we can look internationally for additional hydro. I mean, Brazil's probably the poster child for hydro development. But Yeah, I guess it's it's thinking about the whole system. So Chris was talking about co-benefits earlier. It's making sure that we're not giving up too many other things for rapid hydro development, perhaps in the tropics, other areas. So I do have some concerns about that. Similarly, we haven't talked at all really about nuclear. I mean, there are 50 new reactors being built around the world right now, 500 reactors operating. Hard to imagine, again, for me in the US to see that anytime soon. The only 2 reactors we're building in Georgia are 2x, 4x over budget. They're pushing $30 billion for 2 reactors. So unless we can bring the cost down substantially, it's hard to imagine here. But I think I see a bigger place for hydro internationally, nuclear internationally than I do in our current climate in the United States. But others may have different views.
Sally, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, what was your first question again?
Electrification of other sectors.
Oh, yes, yeah. Sorry, I got so focused on the second part. I think heating, there's huge potential for electrifying heating. I think retrofit will be hard and slow unless there are very targeted programs to do that. Heat pumps, are viable opportunities, or even resistive heating that maybe is not as efficient as a heat pump. Could actually make sense in terms of balancing the electric grid. Water tanks are, a form of thermal storage, so that can have benefits. So I think that has to happen. I think for sure. I think that there are parts of the industrial sector that can be electrified, and there are parts that can't. I think those parts that can, I think we'll see a lot more of that. And there's a lot of industrial action in a lot of resource production, as an example, for shifting to electrified vehicles, for material handling, mining, and so forth. But clearly, the heating, home heating or commercial heating, I think there's a big potential there.
I would just add one aspect, because being from a conservation organization that looks holistically, you can put in dams that provide hydro, but they can create a lot of other environmental consequences that are not good. And we're looking at many, many unsustainable dam projects around the world that would be much better to put in renewable energy of some kind of sort, and could be quite useful, versus destroying, large swathes of habitat for key species or other types of environmental negative consequences. So I think it's really important, as you think about any of these alternatives, to take into account that holistic view. We always talk about one planet, because you don't want to solve one environmental problem and create another. So
I know there's still a bunch of questions. I think several of us can stay around for a one-on-one discussion. Let me close with just a couple of thoughts. I think that in response to this last question, the narrative has been get emissions-free electricity, electrify as much as possible, and then find another way to deal with the emissions through carbon removal or other technologies. And it is true that there are opportunities abundant through the rest of the economy, but a lot of them take a turnover of the existing stocks and are going to unfold over decades, and many of the best opportunities are in places that are building whole new cities, and places where we in the US may need to move cities as a result of sea level rise. But let me just leave you with one thought, and I think it, for me, is the thought that has been most compelling and most persistent through this whole dialogue this afternoon. And it has 2 elements. One is that we do have the technologies to make the changes in emissions much more rapidly than they're being made, and that we need a wide range of strategies to, sort of find the accelerator pedal on this whole agenda. And it's strategies that range from unleashing finance to see where there are real efficiency savings and money that's being left on the table, to having policies that provides powerful incentives. And even though many of these technologies are are best in class in terms of price performance. We do need additional levers, and those need to come from policy action, from shareholder action, from every sector of the economy. And then a second aspect of that is that, you know, you've heard again and again today about the co-benefits of transition from a fossil-based economy to a renewable-based economy. And I think that somehow we haven't gotten to the point where we can really embrace the complementarity of the co-benefits part and the compelling economics of the renewables. It's been a wonderful discussion. I was really impressed at the good ideas that came both from the panelists, from all of you. And if you join me in thanking them, we'll thank all of you at the same time.